All right. I've gotten something like 100 questions. I've got so many. There's no way we're going to be able to get through all of them. But I'll try to deal with them maybe in clusters a little bit. So there was a bunch of questions about how do you compare the importance of different species, which Peter and I discussed ahead of time. Is Peter Singer has not solved all questions around consciousness and exactly what causes consciousness. Do you want to comment on that?
No, I told Rob when we were chatting beforehand that I think the most difficult question that's raised by the kinds of things that I was talking about tonight would be if someone were to say, well, how do you compare, the suffering of, say, I showed the hens in the cages and I showed the sows in the sow stalls and I showed the chickens that are being raised for meat. How would you compare the suffering? Does each one of those chickens suffer just as much as the sow? Does the sow suffer more? Generally, pigs are thought to be more intelligent in various ways than chickens. Does that relate to their capacity to suffer? And then, of course, you could ask the same question comparing human suffering and the suffering of non-human animals. So that's why that word similar is in the principle of equal consideration of interests, because I'm not making the claim that the interests of various different species, including our own, are always the same. In fact, obviously they're not. You must have some interest in hearing about this topic, or you wouldn't have come along tonight. Chickens and pigs have no interest in listening to talks like this. They wouldn't work out what's going on. So we clearly have. Maybe some of you don't either. Yeah, you never know. Those are incredibly difficult sorts of questions. And I think they're so difficult that very little work has really been done on it. Brief conversations I've had, people would say, well, you could talk about brain size maybe, but then we know brain size varies with body size. So then they say, well, you could talk about the ratio of brain size to body size. But then, there's also that may not relate to capacity to suffer. There may be other things that are going on. Birds, for example, have quite small brains, but there have been studies on crows and ravens and jays that show that they are very good at problem solving, quite comparable to primates. Maybe their brains had to be small because they need to be able to fly, and you can't carry big, heavy brains around if you're flying. So maybe they've somehow evolved, super light, compact brains. It's really hard to say. So
the iPhone of brains.
Yeah, this expression "bird brain" is really bad, by the way. I think it's really misleading in that respect. I think that's, following up what Eva just said about we need more research. Well, this is a difficult area where it really would be great if we could find out more about how to make these comparisons.
Okay. Sticking with the animal theme, Peter Singer, first of all, you look great. It's this person text. But secondly, they're not asking if you're single.
I'm glad I'm not female, because this would have been a very sexist comment if I were.
Well, all right, secondly, on a different topic, if animals were unable to feel pain, happiness, etc., would your perspective on their treatment be changed? Just deal with that quickly, horribly.
Completely, yes. I mean, if they were really unable to feel pain, or, essentially, in other words, if they were like plants, as I believe plants to be, then we could still talk about equal consideration for similar interests, but there just wouldn't be any interests that were in any way similar. So there wouldn't really be anything much to say about that.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a whole lot of questions on what if the welfare of farm animals is good? What if they're having a good time? Do you want to comment on that? I think it speaks for itself maybe, but...
Yeah. Look, there's actually there is a decent scientific literature now, which is built up over the period. When I started looking at this in the 1970s, there was one report from something called the Bramble Committee in the UK. There was very little else. But now there's a really serious body of scientific research of people who understand animal behaviour, who understand signs of stress, and you can look at that both behaviourally or you can measure stress hormones and so on. I don't think there's much doubt that the animals in the pictures that I showed you are suffering, that their lives are negative, and that in that sense it would be better if they were not having to go through that at all.
But so if there was a farm where animals were having an amazing time, some kind of animal fantasy land,
Yeah, well, it may not be a complete fantasy land. There are, basically small, not very commercial operations where I think animals are well looked after. So it's not impossible to rear animals so that they're well looked after, and then, kill them humanely. Best kill them on the farm if you can, but it can be done. So that certainly makes a big difference. Yeah, I'm not sure if there's a different question or I misunderstood the previous one, but if animals are having good lives, then clearly the only thing that's wrong with them is that they're being killed prematurely, and that raises a debate about, well, even if they're having short but good lives, is that better than them not having any lives at all, which would be the case if they were not being reared for food? That's an interesting question on which there's now, again, a growing, this time, philosophical literature rather than scientific literature. Let me just say my view is I wouldn't see stopping this as a big priority in the way I do now, because I think there's such a lot of suffering. I think trying to stop the suffering we inflict on farmed animals is a very high priority. If they're having good lives but were being killed, I don't think I'd see it in the same way.
Because, yeah, sticking with the animal questions, in your essay, All Animals Are Equal, you argue that the mere fact of being human is not morally relevant when considering equality. Yet, as you've quite rightly pointed out, most people continue to be speciesist, the vast majority without second thought. What do you think is the single biggest reason people continue to hold discriminatory views, and are you optimistic about change in the future?
If I just have to pick out one, I think it's the fact that most people do eat meat, that they've grown up eating meat, they're used to eating meat, they're not really open to the idea of changing their diet. Obviously, some, fortunately, significant numbers of people are, but if we're talking about the majority of people, I think they're not really, and therefore they're not really able to look what happens to animals in an open and honest way. And the best hope of change for that particular group, therefore, is the development of plant-based alternatives, which we're starting to see now. We're starting to see a much better range of meat substitutes. And those of you who've been vegan or vegetarian for many years will perhaps say, well, why do we need meat substitutes? Can't people think that all of these plant-based, for eating the plants, the vegetables and grains directly is terrific? Yes, but clearly for a lot of people, they don't want to shift their diet. And if you can give them something that is plant-based and tastes to them just like the chicken that they buy in the supermarket, that can be a solution to the problems I was talking about.
Okay, there was a couple of questions, moving away from animals for a bit. There were a couple of questions about the Sustainable Development Goals and how they relate to the principles of effective altruism and whether they're well-designed and things like that. Did anyone have a comment on the Sustainable Development Goals? The successors to the Millennium Development Goals?
Just a short comment. I mean, I think that the goals are ambitious. I think that's fantastic. I do think that there's a challenge in setting 169 goals that you might just overwhelm people and they might really not make progress on any of them. And so there is, obviously people who think that the Millennium Development Goals, which were focusing on 18 goals, was something that was manageable, and 169 goals may be stretching the boundaries a little bit too far. But I do think there is some sense in putting together a package of a vision of where you might want to be. But I do think that there's probably going to be a real challenge in actually making progress against all of those, perhaps because it's such an overwhelming set. To be honest, all I care about is whether anyone said that I looked good.
I'll send through your opinions, guys. All right. Well, there were a couple of questions about population. So, for one, is it counterintuitive to endorse a charity aiming to reduce the number of humans, say, through family planning, while also endorsing a charity aiming at increasing the number of humans by saving their lives, for example, distributing bed nets? Does anyone want to tackle that? There were a couple of questions about, is it bad to save lives because it would be bad if the human population was higher? So, no? I guess Peter could go. You probably heard this one before, right?
Yeah. So, firstly, there are some things that you can do to reduce poverty that are also going to reduce fertility. and there are studies. Now, I might be corrected that there's studies actually spread across the spectrum, Eva, but my reading of studies on educating girls, for example, is that their fertility rate tends to drop. So you educate girls, you give them better economic opportunities and empower them, and also you contribute to reducing population issues. You can also, of course, directly help by helping the 220 million women who would like to have access to contraception but don't to get it. And on the website of The Life You Can Save, thelifeyoucansave.org, you can find PSI, Population Services International, which is an American organisation, American-based, that is doing that. So you can do those things. Should you also try to do it by letting kids die from malaria, for example, or from lack of diarrhea, lack of sanitation, and so on? No, I don't think we have to do that. I think what we have to do is to try to give people more security, in fact, in the number that their children will live. And again, there's some evidence that that will reduce the total number of children that they have once they have some assurance that some of their children will survive to look after them when they get older. That may vary, again, that may well vary culturally in different places. But I think it's worth doing. I think it's worth trying to generally raise the standard of living, raise education, raise economic opportunities, because in quite a large number of countries that has led to a reduction in fertility.
Yes. So if people don't agree with that answer, it is actually possible to go to the developing world and get malaria yourself if you think it's useful for people to die of malaria. So it's... So I don't mean to be quite that snide, but... so following on from the issues about fertility and women's education and women's health, there were a couple of questions about whether focusing on women in particular was likely to be more effective or among the most effective things you could do to reduce poverty. Does anyone have a comment on that?
Well, I guess there is an argument that historically women have been left out of the labour force in many places. There's a lot of potential gains for them. To be honest, it's a bit unclear to me. I wouldn't personally put it probably at the very, very top of the list. It's complicated. And, yeah, this is going to sound terrible, but yes, it really depends on the situation. I understand where that's coming from, for sure. And it's something that lots of people have expressed interest in and makes sense. But I guess we're trying to talk about like the most effective here, so it's hard for me to say that. But maybe you'd beg to differ.
Yeah, I'll not differ so much, but I think that if you look across a range of different indicators, often, and I go back to your list of the things that we should focus on first, the people who are the poorest and most marginalised, often women are in that group. And also if you think about the group that can have a big impact, I mean, women are often the people sort of who have the most direct influence on their families as well. So, there is evidence that if you can, approach the women and change them, you can have a broader impact. So for example, a healthcare intervention, which might be about behaviour change, if you educate the women, you can actually impact the whole family. So I think there is a trickle-down effect that's really important. Thinking about eye health in particular, just obviously something I'm familiar with. 2/3 of the world's blind are women. 3/4 of the people in the world with trachoma, an infection that also causes blindness. It turns the sort of eyelashes in and they scratch your eyes and so on. Again, that is a condition of poverty, and 3/4 of the people who have that are women. So I think that in addressing other issues like healthcare issues, in this case eye care, you have to address women to actually tackle that issue.
Just one last thing on that, actually, that I was reminded of as you were talking. So there has been some work. You remember a paper with a very splashy title saying, "Girls' education, nothing else matters." That this has the potential to really change a lot of things. I guess I would also. I guess my sort of ambivalence here is it really. I can think of some cases where you've got a labor market that is not going to let the women in, even if they are educated, even if they do have the skills. You can have training programs where you're getting women to be very empowered, but then they're actually at higher risk in their communities potentially. And there is some evidence also that domestic violence will actually increase as a result of some of the kinds of interventions that are targeting women's empowerment, sadly. So it's a little bit tricky. I mean, definitely it's an area where, for sure, they're amongst the most disadvantaged in some cases. But the way that one goes about it would probably be very important.
All right, I've got one for you, Eva. You've looked at all these impact assessments for different projects. She never answers this question when I ask it, but I'm going to ask again. So you've looked at all these different impact assessments. If you had to donate to a particular intervention, what would it be?
You've asked me this question before, Rob. I was anticipating it.
But you always evade. I want to hear an answer.
I have an answer for you this time.
Excellent. That's good.
It's the first time. I think as I was, you can tell we've been having this conversation, and I've never been able to give an answer. And the more I thought about it, the more I think that actually that does suggest to me that further research is actually the way that I would go, actually. It makes it sound a little bit sad, but I guess given that there could be interventions out there that are actually much more effective than even the ones that right now we're talking about. I think effective altruists, there's some general consensus, quote unquote, of deworming, of unconditional cash transfers, what have you. Well, there could be other things that we're not even thinking about that aren't even on the table because we aren't even doing we don't have that research there yet. So that's, I guess, where I would stand now.
I'm intrigued. Can you say a little bit more about what kind of things you would like to see out there being researched into their effectiveness?
So one area that is there's not super much on is people keep on having this question of, well, what if I want to what about supporting a party politically or trying to get some political changes? What is the role for that? I guess going back to Rob's thing of the 1 in 20,000 chance of swaying an election or what have you. There's not very much on that. There's very little work still on animal advocacy research. It's growing, but it's very small still. So yeah, I think there's still some holes. I think the main problem is that we've been focusing a lot in development on these RCTs, which are great, which I run myself sometimes, but miss the macro picture. And we're focusing on often charities and often that might not particularly scale well as well. There is an issue of, sometimes these smaller impact evaluations of a small program will find large effects, and then if you actually try to scale up that program, it fails miserably. So there's some room in there as well. Sorry, that's a little bit of a meandering answer, but there are several areas, I guess, I would like to see more.
I just saw your list of things that cause cancer and decided I was going to invest in wine and tomatoes. They seemed like good options. Yeah.
All right, slightly different area. Where would the panel rank the prevention of human extinction as an altruistic goal? The risk is low, but the repercussions would include a very large number of future lives. Peter, do you want to start? So,
thanks a lot.
Pro or anti-human extinction? Another thing you can go and voluntarily do if you want.
I suppose that's a question, given that I've been talking about animal advocacy, and if you could only make humans extinct and leave the rest of the species, some people might think they might be better off, but then that gets into the question about whether there's a lot of suffering in wild animals anyway, which is another complicated issue. So I'm against human extinction. I'm somewhat of a... You'll be surprised to hear. I'm somewhat of an optimist about, firstly, the quality of life, that our quality of life, unlike those of those chickens, is on the whole positive. And secondly, that it's likely to get better if we survive the next century or two. So if we can avoid some of the risks now, I think that we'll gradually, get smarter or wiser, certainly technologically more adept, and we'll be able to give everybody around a high quality of life.
Yeah.
So I think, but your question, of course, was a little more difficult than that. Your question was, how is it a priority? Yes. So the risks are fairly low, but nevertheless, it's a big thing. So a small risk of a big disaster is worth trying to reduce even further. You do have to ask, how big a disaster is it exactly when we're getting into reducing small risks further? And that's another difficult question, because some people, when you talk about human extinction, say, well, that would be the loss of, let's say, if it happened tomorrow, 7.6 billion human deaths. Okay, that's a bad thing. But other people say, no, wait a minute, it's not just that. It's all of the lives that will not come into existence because the species has come into existence, has gone extinct. So for millions or possibly even billions of years, there will be, if we don't become extinct, billions, perhaps many billions, because perhaps we'll colonize other planets eventually, of lives. And if I'm right in thinking that they are going to be lives of good quality, then you might think that that's a huge loss as well. All of these vast number of lives that cannot be lived. Other people say, well, wait a minute, they're not missing out on anything, they're not even going to exist. So it doesn't really matter, I'm concerned about really existing concrete people, not merely possible ones. And that's a fairly deep philosophical divide that it's actually quite hard to move people on once you raise that issue.
Yeah, I'm going to join Peter in taking the very brave stance that it would be bad if I and everyone here and all the things that we loved were destroyed. So, yeah, I think I actually rate existential risks pretty highly, probably above most other causes, in particular because I buy this idea that if humanity goes extinct, it's like very bad that we lose out on all of the potential human flourishing that would happen in the rest of history. And also because they're often pretty neglected. Not all of them, there's quite a lot of people, say, trying to prevent nuclear war, but other things like new hazards from biotechnology, there's relatively few people working on them, so something that I think it's useful to look into. Did you want to comment on that?
Only a very short thing, which is that I have also heard an argument that even if you think that humans overall tend to be bad for other species, that things are improving, and so if humans manage to stick around, there's actually the potential to improve things quite a bit, potentially even one day dealing with wild animal suffering. So it could eventually, in the long run, be a net gain even for other species.
Yeah. A lot of people asked about wild animal suffering. Do any of you want to talk about that?
No, sorry. But just to answer your last question, I'm not...
sorry, I interrupted.
There's a few people, that I wouldn't mind being extinct, but notwithstanding that...
I'm sitting right here.
Not you, it was the Trump thing that brought that up.
Okay.
But by and large, I'm anti-extinction, so there we go.
Excellent. It's a happy world. Okay, so wild animal suffering, anyone going to bite on that? Peter, you've said what you want to say?
I don't think it's an issue that we're even close to being ready to tackle, I have to say. Yeah. Sure, if you do have a cat and you see your cat that's caught a bird and is just playing with it, hasn't killed it, yes, stop your cat from playing with it. But do you want to get out there in the areas of habitat that humans are basically not having any huge effect other than our greenhouse gas emissions, I suppose? But we're not, do we want to try and stop the predators from slowly and painfully killing the prey? I don't think we're ready to do that. I don't think we know how to do that. And
send them to Scared Straight or something like that.
Which will make them more
naughty,
more callous predators, right?
Yeah, make them catch more birds. Yeah. Scared vegetarian as a cat. Yeah. All right. I've got. There's one that I can answer. So this person says, after 3 months, a person who wins the lottery is as happy as someone who becomes paraplegic. Does this hedonic treadmill suggest health interventions have minimal impact on well-being or welfare? So I can answer that because I read that paper earlier this year because we were doing a long analysis on income and happiness. And this is not true. This is completely not true. This is like really widely cited inaccurate thing. Basically, they only studied like 9 people anyway, so it's like negligible sample. And in any case, the people who won the lottery were significantly happier than the people who got paraplegia, shockingly. But this was like too good a story for the media to go and fact check. Anyway, so We've got a page, if you search for like 80,000 hours, income and happiness, we've got like thousands and thousands of words on this topic. Basically, it seems like when you're really poor, more money makes you happier, probably. As you become richer, it like becomes worth less. Like for most people here, more money isn't really going to make you happier. It's kind of a logarithmic relationship. So if you double your income, then an extra dollar becomes worth half as much. Another thing is, this person's asked about, does that suggest that health interventions have minimal impact? I mean, health affects your welfare above and beyond its effect just on your income. So it does, like if you're healthier, you can earn more. But being unhealthy, especially if you have inflammation, like you're infected with a disease, then it tends to make you much more likely to get depression and be unhappy. But I think there is an interesting question here. Quite a lot of people give to Give Directly, which is a charity that finds extremely poor people and then raises their income. They give them about $1,000, which is something like the household income for a year or two. And there is some evidence that makes people feel happier, but it's not completely clear, and the effect didn't seem to be really large. There's someone working on this at the Center for Effective Altruism looking at, if you make people richer, how strong is the experimental evidence that giving people cash actually makes people more cheerful? And I think it probably does, but there's some question marks there. And I think if you want to make people if you want to make people much happier, potentially a better thing is to just focus on things that make them happy rather than giving them more money. So a lot of people have mental health problems, which are like devastating for people's health. Having depression is probably worse than being very poor, and you can potentially target that directly. I know some people involved in effective altruism who are working on apps to try to make people more cheerful, things where they're like gratitude journaling and that kind of thing. And I think that's like a promising vein of research where you can go just directly to improving people's welfare without having to go through them earning more money. On the other hand, increasing economic growth is probably lasts longer than just making people happy at the moment. So if you can improve productivity in a country and build up the infrastructure, that affects many future generations in a way that someone doing gratitude journaling doesn't. So it can get a bit tricky. Did anyone else want to comment on that?
Well, just on the bit of unconditional cash transfers, there's also the issue of, well, if you give everybody unconditional cash transfers, then what happens? There's these equilibrium effects of, well, it just changes then the market. And I don't think there's fantastic evidence yet really on that. I mean, there were some experiments in the 70s in the US that got a lot of press, but yeah.
I watched a fantastic TED talk the other night which said that basically after studying this group of people over a period of about 50 years and comparing their lives, it basically found that the quality of their relationships and their interpersonal relationships was the most important determinant in their happiness. Yeah. So I think if we're just going down a path about economics, we're probably not hitting the mark.
In fact,
Sorry, no, go ahead.
Well, the monetary transfers could, in some cases, actually make some of those interpersonal relationships deteriorate a bit, right? I mean, you've got the Rottenkin theorem of, somebody gets a windfall and everybody comes running to you for money. So, anyway.
You're talking about the relationships outside the family, but they might actually improve the relationships inside the family. You don't have to worry so much about, every cent that's spent. But I was just going to say about Give Directly, I think you have to give this organisation credit because they're an extremely transparent organisation. They're one of the relatively small number of organisations that will tell you that they're doing a randomised trial of something before the trial is actually done. So if the results come in badly for them, they can't forget that they ever did such a trial. They have to post the results. So I think they're quite brave in that, and I think that's something that other organisations ought to follow. And my reading of it, I'm not familiar perhaps with the research, my reading of it is that it has come out positively, at least to this point.
Yeah, so it comes out positively on almost every outcome measure, except maybe whether the people say that they're happier at that moment. But the sample isn't so big. I think this is just a tentative result, but it seems like it's affecting other things maybe more than people's immediate, than whether they report that they're feeling happy. Like reduces their stress, say, but then, yeah.
That may raise a question about the value of people's self-reporting of happiness, which there have been other questions raised about that as well.
Yeah. It would definitely surprise me if taking someone who's living on $1 a day and raising their income to $2 or $3 a day didn't improve their happiness. That would be very counterintuitive, but the universe is full of counterintuitive things. So someone says evidence-based evaluation is absolutely vital, but how do we avoid the risk of becoming too conservative and supporting established proven programs rather than more adventurous things? I can tackle that one if no one else wants to. Right, yeah, so... Excellent. More time for me to talk. So effective altruism, has become very associated in the media and in the public consciousness with just doing things that have already been proven to work. And I think that is questionable branding on our part. I think for many people who are very talented and have the ability to really try to do new things, it's probably that they can probably have more social impact by doing research and being innovative and testing new programs. And while once you have a success, it's very important to scale it up so that you actually make full use of that research. I think we definitely don't want to get stuck in just doing the same things forever. We need to be trying to find things that are rigorously testing to try to find things that are better than what we were doing before. And especially, within the organization, we try to specialize in different kinds of cause areas because there's so much to learn. And I tend to focus on these existential risks and threats to civilization as a whole. And with that stuff, clearly it's almost always going to be really adventurous. There's no RCT on how do you reduce the risk of nuclear war. Because I think that's a very important cause area, I think people should not be afraid to do new, difficult things that have a high risk of failure. I think they should be willing to take risks.
I think I agree with you that effective altruism has a clear place in what I would almost call a scale-up of of ideas that have been tested, and there is a separate but related place around, and a lot of people who are quite engaged in actually supporting innovation and actually, people, it's like the investment market. Some people want to have a low risk, but low reward sort of expected return, and some people want to have a high risk and high return, and that's what innovation gets you. Some of those things will fail and some will succeed and make spectacular changes, and I think there's a place for both opportunities. Where I do think there's a little bit of thought still to happen is this whole issue of sustainability. So I'm not sure yet that anyone really has nailed this issue of, an intervention that needs to be delivered every year. Let's say a bed net that needs to be, delivered every year or 2 years, and an organisation that just delivers that, bed net every year or 2 years versus one that perhaps creates sustainable social enterprises that will generate bed nets forever. And I don't. The reason I say I don't think they've nailed that is because I don't actually think there's been a consistent way of measuring the impact of those two different things. So I think where I'd like to see some more progress is actually looking at whether a change is sustainable versus a change that needs to be delivered every year or every few years.
Sure. So there were a couple of questions about diversity. Someone pointed out that everyone on the panel is white. It's like a lot of middle class, upper middle class people here, and unfortunately that tends to be the case in most of the organisations I've worked in. Does this mean that we don't have a sufficient diversity of perspectives, that we're potentially going to get blinkered to things that are really important because we all come from the same, all cut from the same cloth? Anyone want to bite on that? Easy question.
I'll nibble on it. Okay. So, I mean, if, for example, we're interested in global poverty, then, it's clear that we're not going to have people in an audience in Melbourne who are in extreme poverty. I mean, if they're in Australia, they're getting a level of social security that puts them above the extreme poverty level. I'm not denying that there are people in poverty in Melbourne, but it's relative poverty for Australian society. So, in a way, I don't think it would be terribly relevant if we had a sort of an Australian African, if you like, someone of African descent who was living in Melbourne, earning whatever people in Melbourne typically earn, and was part of our group. I mean, yes, we might get some different perspectives, but I don't think we should be too anguished about the fact that the movement is largely white and middle class. That may change. Hopefully it will change eventually, but I don't think we need to feel that we have to have a kind of quota of various different ethnic, cultural groups in the community.
And I think as long as I mean, the priority for me would be ensuring that the innovations and ideas and the change is being driven with the inclusion and participation of the people who are most directly affected by it. Some of the most innovative charities right now are very much what I would call southern NGOs. You take an organisation like BRAC, based in Bangladesh, and they're doing extraordinary things. So, I think as long as those sorts of organisations are in the mix and ones that can be supported by, the support and charity from people here, I think that's a fantastic outcome.
All right, we had a bunch of questions about climate change and saving the environment and where that ranks. Do you want to comment on that, Peter?
So I think climate change, in terms of your criteria, Rob, is certainly a huge issue. It's not a neglected issue. There's a lot of people working on it, and there's a reasonable amount of money going into it. I think, and the other question is, to what extent is it a solvable issue? Obviously, I really hope it's a solvable issue, and I think that we ought to be working on it as active and concerned citizens, and I hope that all of you considered climate change in casting your vote in the recent elections, for example. I think there are things we can do about it, but in terms of am I going to make this the cause into which I put most of my energy and the amount of money that I donate to NGOs and so on. I'm not doing that at present because I'm not convinced that I'm going to be able to have enough impact. If somebody could show me strategies that are, and I have given some support to 350.org and other organisations like that, certainly to the Australian Greens, but I'd need to have a clearer strategy of where I'm going to have an impact on the global problem, because it is a global problem, obviously.
Yeah. No? Okay.
I agree with everything you said.
Okay. Yeah, at 80,000 hours, I think we broadly agree with that. We think it's a pressing problem, but maybe not among the very most pressing problems. And mainly because about $100 billion is spent on it already, so it's not very neglected in the scheme of things. That said, it's a very the scale is very large because it could, if you had runaway climate change, it could potentially kill a large fraction of all people. So it's a big deal.
So actually, since 80,000 hours is advising people going into ethical careers, if you had somebody who was talented at political organisation and activism and so on, would you see that as a reasonable option for them?
Yeah, definitely. Do you mean for climate change specifically?
Yeah, well,
right,
yes.
Yeah.
Yes, thinking about going into that area in the hope that you can make an impact there.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good strategy. We talk about matching up your skills with the cause that you're working on, with the approach that you're taking. I think advocacy and policy and politics is one that's very well matched to working on climate change. The government can potentially have a large impact on that. And in general, we think if you're someone who's likely to be able to get into Parliament, that's probably among the most valuable things that you could do, because the amount of money that the government spends per politician is very large, and you do the math and think about if you become a minister, what kind of budget can you control and how much? It just looks like very large numbers in the tens of millions or hundreds of millions. An expectation. So
just on that investment area you were talking about before, I think with China making substantial investments in this whole space, in terms of environmentally friendly energy and so on, I think that's a real opportunity that will see change. And once China moves, that's going to have a massive impact. And this is probably my question, if I may, for Peter. I understand, I think last week, the Chinese government announced a goal to halve meat consumption. And I just wonder whether you think that's likely to be successful and have any impact on animal welfare and production.
Yeah, I'm certainly hopeful. I thought that was the most hopeful sign to come out of China in respect of meat, because if you look at the statistics on meat consumption, per capita meat consumption, actually, the United States has dipped now since about 2010. The graph goes steadily up for the whole of the 20th century and up to about 2010. And now it's just started to curve down, which I think is a really hopeful sign. If you look at the graph for China, it's one of those hockey stick curves. It's going not straight up, but it's going up very steeply. And it was hard to see much actually changing this. But the government did announce these policies of how much meat it wanted people to eat, thought that there should be a cap on it, and as you say, it was pretty close to halving it. Now, are they actually going to put the effort into it to make that stick, to make it work? Well, I guess the government in China can do something like that more easily, perhaps, than governments in some other countries. But will it? I'm not really sure. I'm moderately hopeful, but I'm waiting to see, I guess you'd say.
Yeah. All right. We'll probably give it a couple more minutes because we started a bit late. But are there any questions that you wanted to ask one another?
So I have a question actually for Kirsten, which I hope is not too unfair. But you were talking about difficulties of assessing, measuring things, and you were talking about the various things that Fred Hollows does. Those of you who have seen Fred Hollow's advertising will know that it has this saying, this little slogan, "You can prevent blindness for $25," right? So I'm genuinely interested because Fred Hollows is one of the organisations that's recommended by the Life You Can Save. I'm genuinely interested if you think that's a defensible claim.
Yeah, I genuinely do. There's a number of countries that we work in where it literally does cost $25 to do a cataract surgery that restores sight. And so, I mean, when I talked earlier tonight about those IOL factories that create the lenses that go into somebody's eyes, the reason for investing in those factories was because at that time, the cost of a lens to go into somebody's eyes was around about $150. And so this was sort of like a catalytic investment to sort of change the market. So those sort of large manufacturing plants, and we weren't the only ones, there were a number of built in India at the same time as well, and it brought the cost of those lenses down to around about $5. So from $150 down to about $5. And so those sort of catalytic investments can really change the marketplace, and that was the sort of thing that was instrumental in actually being able to bring the cost of surgery down so dramatically.
Any other questions? All right, there was one for me about passion. Someone was saying, well, you do all this analysis, and then what if you find out the most important problem to work on is one that you just don't care about personally? And like that could happen. I think at 80,000 hours, our view is that you more or less have to be passionate, or you have to be interested in what you're working on in order to have a good chance of succeeding, especially if you're doing something innovative. It's very rare to find someone who started a business and it took off and they weren't really interested or passionate about it in some form. But we also think it's possible to become passionate about much more than you're already passionate about or what you're thinking about. We have a really long investigation about what creates job satisfaction, like what makes people passionate about things. And basically, they have to think that they're making a valuable contribution. So if you start working on a problem, maybe that you're not initially interested in, but then you feel like it's significant, that it's actually affecting people in a big way, and you feel like you're doing a good job at making a difference to it, in general, people do become passionate about that over time. So it's true that you do need to be passionate, but that's more of an outcome of doing valuable work on an important issue than like something that necessarily drives you into it in the first place. Anyway, I'm doing a 4-hour workshop this weekend. If you want to come to EA Global X, talking about all kinds of different things, like what creates job satisfaction, more things about problem selection and how you can do the most good. So if you come to the full conference, you can listen to me for another 4 hours talk about these things. So, yeah. Anyone else want to make some final remarks? No? Want to big up their own presentations this weekend? It's going to be a blast.
Well, just I'll endorse your plug. I think there is still space at the conference if people want to come, and I know not everybody here is registered for it. So if you're interested, I'm going to be speaking as well tomorrow. So again on a couple of different things. So I think it's going to be a great event. And thanks very much for coming tonight too.